All right, so for more reaction to President Trump's Middle East plan, we're now joined by our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, thanks very much for joining us. So people are now have been reacting since it was announced, this deal of the century, getting a lot of pushback from a lot of areas, but the Palestinians are for sure leading that charge.
Absolutely, the deal of the century, Peter, and also described by President Trump as a win-win for both sides. Of course, the Palestinians, as you heard in that clip from Riyad Mansour, the permanent observer of the Palestinian state to the United Nations, essentially rejecting this as an attempt really to take away from the Palestinians and give to the Israelis. What we are seeing now is efforts certainly from both the Palestinians and the Arab group here at the United Nations, and opposed by the Israelis and the United States, in terms of lobbying the international mood, really taking the temperature of how the international consensus around this issue is either going to diverge or coalesce around one or the other in terms of the opposing sides here. We are going to see efforts in the Security Council. The Palestinian ambassador talking about Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians, coming to the Security Council in the next 2 to 3 weeks to address them. And in that meeting, Peter, to attempt to pass a resolution that would essentially reject the proposals contained in that deal of the century. If, of course, they fail in the Security Council, given the United States veto there being a permanent 5-member, they will then move efforts into the General Assembly, where resolutions are adopted. They are not necessarily legally binding, but they do take the temperature of how the world is going to respond to this issue. It is political theater, but certainly all roads leading to the United States. There was to the United Nations, of course. There was also a statement earlier this week, Peter, from the Israeli mission to the United Nations. Ambassador Danny Danon releasing this, saying that ahead of an expected Security Council debate, the Palestinians are working to generate support from Council member states and to promote a protest vote in the General Assembly. The Israeli mission to the UN is working to thwart these efforts and will lead a concerted diplomatic campaign with the United States in advance of the Trump administration's announcement. So even before the details of this plan were announced at the White House alongside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu the other day, Israeli efforts already underway here at the United Nations to lobby support in rejecting Palestinian attempts that would undermine certainly what's contained in that document.
What have the Palestinians pointed to as the most offensive part of this peace plan?
Well, there's a whole list of those, but we can start with settlements, for example, the over 150 essentially illegal settlements. In terms of international law, in terms of UN Security Council resolutions, settlements that have expanded over the decades are deemed illegal in terms of international law. What we are seeing in this new peace plan is that the United States is proposing that those settlements become Israeli territory permanently, that Israel will be allowed to annex those settlements in addition to annexing and taking control of the Jordan Valley, essentially the area that separates the country of Jordan from the West Bank. Israel would then surround all of those territories. So that, I think, is certainly one of the big affronts. They feel that they are undermining Palestinian nationality and sovereignty. There was also a tweet, Peter, earlier today from the Iranian foreign minister that really refers to these settlements, certainly the map that President Trump tweeted, calling the Palestinian territory Bantustans. We also hear the word apartheid thrown around a lot. Mohammed Zarif tweeting, could Mandela ever have imagined the re-emergence of Bantustans decades after the liberation of South Africa? Quote, the vision for peace looks more like a highway to hell. We Muslims need to wake up. The US never was and never can be anything resembling an honest broker. And then he tweeted pictures of an old South Africa showcasing the various Bantustans that South Africa had, and then juxtaposing that with the map that President Trump is proposing for a future Palestinian state, and showing just how that is an archipelago, essentially, of areas, a discontiguous Palestinian state connected by tunnels and highways, but representing essentially, an archipelago of islands in the Caribbean, Peter.
All right, so I mean, there's a lot at stake here, and it seems as if the Palestinians are saying that, look, if you carry on with this, things like the Oslo Accords will be thrown out, and the cooperation that they've been giving in terms of security will also be, they'll feel free to walk away from that. So a big gamble that the President of the United States has taken, and if they carry on with this, it could open a can of worms that they might not be able to deal with.
Yeah, and what you also hear, Peter, from the Palestinian, certainly the Palestinian ambassador, Dr. Riyad Mansour, is that they want the international community to drive this process. They do not recognize the United States as an honest broker anymore in terms of these long-standing peace negotiations, essentially a conflict that has lasted since the very existence of the United Nations. They believe that this should be driven by the quartet. They believe that there's a greater role here for the United Nations Security Council, but of course overcoming various vetoes, the national proclivities of certain permanent 5 members will determine what sort of outcome we can get in terms of the Security Council, but certainly a lot at risk here. But first things first, they will come to the Security Council. They will try to embarrass the United States and the Israeli position if they get, for example, 14 votes out of 15 in the Security Council in terms of sending that message to the Americans. That will be seen as a small victory. If they take it to the General Assembly and get a huge majority out of the 193 members there, that will also be somewhat of a symbolic repudiation of this peace plan. And remember, the United States has offended many of its allies based on various unilateral decisions, most notably their withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Agreement with Iran, essentially the Iran nuclear deal. So what's going to be very careful to watch here, what we need to be careful in watching, is what the Europeans are going to do here. You know, Abbas is also traveling to the African Union summit next weekend. He will try and coalesce various support from the various regions there. He is talking at a ministerial meeting in Cairo, in the Egyptian capital, this weekend to Arab ministers. So there's a lot of diplomacy underway here in the background. And seeing where those chips fall, either in the Security Council and the General Assembly, will determine where we go from there.
All right, and perhaps finally, further complicating this is that not everybody, particularly in the Arab world, in the Middle East, are on the same page over this.
Yeah, a big factor here is the close relationship between the Saudis and the United States. The Emirates countries, Oman, I believe their ambassadors were at the White House when that announcement was made. Yeah, divisions certainly that need to be overcome, certainly in the Arab world. But certainly history will show us that the Saudis, remember, the Saudi Arabia ran for the Security Council a couple of years ago, a couple of terms back, and they won a seat on the Security Council and then withdrew from that seat. If my memory serves me correctly, Jordan then stepped in to take that seat at the last moment, because they believed that there was an unfair process underway in the Security Council vis-a-vis the Palestinian question. So they've been very clear historically about what they will and will not support in terms of the Palestinian cause. But certainly interesting to hear what the Saudis will do given the just announced peace plan or deal of the century, whatever you'd like to call it, Peter, earlier this week.
All right, Sherwin, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much indeed. That's our US correspondent speaking to us live from New York about this deal of the century, which is getting a lot of pushback, as you could imagine, particularly from the Palestinians.